Harsh light, bright washed out skies or dark underexposed foregrounds, some conditions can be a nightmare for photographers, particularly if you're new. How often have you framed up a beautiful shot only to find your sky is blown out or your beautiful foreground has just become a dark, murky mess of shadows and underexposed outlines? I know it can be frustrating, particularly in the beginning, but take heart because there are a few strategies that can help you manage those tricky lighting conditions, and by far the simplest of these is something called bracketing. My name's Steve, this is Behind the Tripod, and in today's video we're going to be demystifying bracketing and walking you through how you can use this easy technique to manage difficult lighting conditions in your own photos. We'll then look at some bracketed photographs and I'll walk you through the editing process in Lightroom. But before we get stuck into bracketing, let's look at the problem in a little bit more detail by exploring something called dynamic range. You see, put simply, dynamic range describes the amount of tone that your camera's sensor can record between full black and full white. So a camera with a high dynamic range will be able to see a lot of shades of grey between full black and full white. This will mean that the camera with a large dynamic range will be able to pick out more details in the shadows and in the highlights at the same time. On the flip side of this, a camera with a low dynamic range won't be able to record nearly as many shades of black and white. So subjects in shadow may become black or lighter elements may become just pure white. So as a rule of thumb, the greater the dynamic range of your sensor, the more detail you'll be able to pick out and record within the highlights and the shadows. But, and this is a really important but, even the most expensive cameras on the market do not have anywhere as near a good dynamic range as your eyes. You see, your eyes can pick out a lot of details in the shadows and the highlights, which is why you can see all the details on the side of a dark mountainside whilst also being able to see the clouds and the details in the sky. Technical warning now, we're going to talk about stops of light, and if you're not sure what stops are, don't worry, just please watch the video above and that will go through it with you. Right, so the best cameras on the market currently have a dynamic range of around 15 stops. However, your eyes will typically see up to around 20 stops of dynamic range. In basic terms, that means that you have about 25% more dynamic range than the best cameras on the market. And this is the reason why your eyes can pick out those details that you see in the rain and those ranges of tones that your camera just can't see. So now that we've established why your camera might struggle to pick up exactly what you're seeing with your eyes, let's add another layer. But before we do, if you're enjoying this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more tutorials such as this. You see, light is not always equal. For example, I want you to think about a photographer's studio, and in this studio there'll be absolutely no natural light from outside, and all the light will be very carefully managed through the studio lighting and the flashes and the various rigs that they have. This controls the direction of light, but crucially for this video, it reduces the dynamic range to a more manageable level so that the camera can pick out all the tones within the highlights and the shadows. And now I want you to contrast this with a landscape photograph where the photographer is outside. They can't really control the light and he or she is trying to balance their exposure to make sure they don't lose any of the details in either the sky or in the foreground. This is where finding the correct exposure can get really tricky. So how can we increase the dynamic range of our cameras to allow them to see what we see with our eyes? Well, short of finding a different composition, we really have two options. So traditionally, photographers used filters such as this one. And you can see here there's a clear side and a dark side, and if I flip it the other way, you would traditionally put the dark side over the sky and the lighter clear side would be over the foreground, and that essentially reduces the dynamic range within the image. I still use these on occasion, but the second option, which is called bracketing, is by far the easier, the quicker, the cheaper, and probably the more effective in some situations. You see, bracketing is a technique where you take multiple photographs of the same image, each with a slightly different exposure setting, and then in the editing software you merge the images together, which effectively gives you a much larger dynamic range and allows you then to pick out the details in the shadows whilst also holding on to those details in the highlights. If you have a digital camera, chances are you'll have a button that looks a little bit like this on the side of your camera. This is the bracket button, and if you press it and hold it and turn the function wheel or whatever wheel or a setting you use on your camera to change your settings, you'll be able to change the bracketing setting on your camera. When you turn the wheel, holding down the bracket button, you're essentially adding photographs either side of your exposure. So you'll have your picture in the middle that's perfectly exposed, but you may have 1 or 2 photos that are a stop or 2 underexposed, and you'll have some pictures, 1 or 2, that are overexposed as well, by either a stop or 2 stops. You can generally set this up through your camera. Quick pro tip for you, take a picture of your hand before each bracketed sequence, and again at the end of each bracketed sequence. That will give you a dark image at the beginning and the end of each bracket, so when you come to edit, you'll know where you are within your bracketing sequence. And another tip for you is, if you can, take your image on a timer. If you do it on a timer, the pictures will happen automatically and you won't have to keep track of whereabouts within the bracket you are, because it's very easy to get a little bit muddled up and then end up shooting overexposed or underexposed, or thinking that you've done a picture when you haven't. I figured out both of these things the hard way, so I hope that you can learn from me so you don't have to go through the same learning curve. So let's look at an example now of a bracketed photo in Lightroom and how I can edit it. So this is a picture I took of Whitby Abbey a few months ago, and it was taken on a very bright morning. And as you can see, it wasn't the best conditions for photography. There's some harsh shadows, some blown out highlights. There's not much detail left in the sky here, and it was very difficult conditions. So I decided to bracket it, and I'll just show you what I mean by bracketing. So this was the good exposure, and then there's one picture that was taken as a stop underexposed, and you can see there that we've lost some of the detail in the darks. They've gone to black, but we've managed to keep some of the details in the lights, and we've got much more detail in the sky now. And then the lights are here, and you can see so much blown out in the lights, but we've got more detail now in the shadows. We've managed to keep that detail and in these shadows in here. And that's what I'm looking to get from an image like this. Now what I'm looking to do is combine these. I've taken these as black and white. The picture will be black and white eventually, but I also thought it's a really good way of showing you what it looks like when in terms of the tonal differences. So if I highlight these 3, so I'm going to click on the first image, click shift and go last image, that will highlight all 3 of them. And then I'm going to, and I'm going to come up here to photo merge. And we're looking for HDR, which is high dynamic range. That means. We talked about dynamic range before. This means it's a high dynamic range image. So I'm going to click on that. I'll let it do its thing for a moment. It'll think about it. Okay, so I paused the video there and I'm back in now, and it's done its thing. It can take a little while, but it's merged here 3 images successfully. And I'm going to click on the square there because it's useful to see it large, because you want to make sure that you've got what you want. But you can see there's more detail now in the darks. There's more detail in the sky, and it's just a much more evenly balanced image. Now again, I'm going to go into post-processing. I might darken the darks and lighten the lights again to make it a little bit less flat. But to start with, it just gives you more to work with in terms of your post-processing. You've got some options up here: auto align and auto settings. Keep these ticked, that's really important. It'll make sure everything sits on top of each other when you're doing this, and that's how it should do. And this section here called the ghost, I think it's called the cost. When we're doing that part, it's just really for if things move in the image, between the images, so people walking in and out of frames or windows, water that moves slightly, this will help to kind of to ease into that little bit. So you can do none, low, medium, high. I've ticked none because decosting isn't needed in this image at all. Create a stack, I don't need to create a stack, and what I'm going to do now is hit merge. And it will take a while to do this, so I'm going to pause the video again. Okay, so my computer's quite slow, so that took a little bit of time, which is why I paused the video there. But you can see it's brought it up now, and it's inserted the HDR into the other images that I had from that sequence. So you'll be able to tell which one it is because they're all NEF files for me. The middle one here is called HDR DNG, and it says HDR after the number of the image, so you can tell that's the HDR image. So let's compare it with the image from before. This is the image that was a well exposed image in this harsh light. I'm going to bring up a side-by-side comparison, and I'm going to drop in the HDR next to it. Okay, and you can see, okay, it's not marked massively different, but you can see in the shadows here and in the windows here we have a little bit more detail. There's detail in here. So on this side it's a lot darker. Okay, likewise from the sides over here you can see them much more different here, where you can pick out more detail in here. Now it's obviously, as I said, it's a flat image. I will go in and edit this, and I'll bring out an image from this eventually, but that's just to show you what you can do with HDR to try and save some of the highlights and from the shadows as well. Have you tried bracketing and filters, and which do you prefer? Please let me know in the comments below, and if you'd like to learn more about editing in Lightroom, consider watching this video right here.